Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm Indu Saxena from the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. This event is in the series of our book talk series. And today we are going to discuss on Dr. Chris Kowalski's book, Nations in the Balance, India-Burma campaign from 1943 to 1944. And for this, we have Professor McManus and from Missouri University. And we have the moderator, Jessica Burton. She is a PhD candidate at Rutgers University. And I would like to announce that attendees, publisher offers the 35% discount for this volume. And we have put it in the chat. The discount code is in the chat. Just click the link that will take you to the page where the book is at the publisher website. And you can just put the code there and you will get the discount and will receive a copy in your hand. And one more thing I would like to announce that the views presented here are personal, should not be constituted to any institutions and any organizations. Thank you. And now I would like to hand over to Jessica. Jessica, over to you.
Sure. It's a pleasure to announce our discussant, Professor John C. McManus, professor, author, and military historian, and a leading expert on the history of the American combat experience. He is the Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology, and is currently in residence at the U.S. Naval Academy as the Leo A. Schifrin Chair of Naval and Military History. His critically acclaimed books on World War II include Deadly Sky, The American Combat Airman in World War II, September Hope, The American Side of a Bridge Too Far, and The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, The Big Red One at Omaha Beach. Professor, I'll turn it over to you now.
Oh, hi. Yeah, thanks so much, Jessica. I appreciate it. One thing, I was my Naval Academy stint in it a couple of years ago, so I'm back in Missouri S&T now. But boy, I had a great time with that. It was an amazing experience. Yeah, so Chris Kowalski and his incredible book Nations in the Balance is our focus today, and just in a larger sense, where I wanted to start with you, Chris, is just in the kind of popular memory, I guess, of the China-Burma-India theater and its central importance on World War II strategy. But I think as we look back now, even more so than we might have thought. So for instance, the Allied grand strategy is Germany first. And I think for decades, that was just kind of accepted that mattered and that China was a kind of tertiary thing, at least in the kind of certainly in the British view, but in the American view as well. But I think looking back now, you could argue that maybe China should have been front and center, given 21st century realities, that the less resources that the Allies poured into the China-Burma-India theater, the less influence and the less impact maybe on what kind of China you're going to have going forward. So I think your book, it takes that 43-44 period, and it's just the central kind of key moment and brings that to life for us. How do you see that?
I think you raise an interesting point, and one of the things that drew me to the stories, not only are they compelling human dramas, these battles that occur in and around Burma in that theater in from December 1943 through August of 1944, but the geopolitical states, and that's why I chose the title "Nations in the Balance," is it really is competing for the highest stakes, not just for military domination, but also in many ways unleashing forces that will impact the history of Asia over the next 75 years. To your point about China, the first truly Allied command theater that was set up was actually China Theater in December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. They made Chiang Kai-shek, who Generalissimo, of course, the ruler of China, also commander of the Chinese Armed Forces. They made him the Supreme Allied commander for China Theater. And then all the other ones come out from that later in 1942, 43, and of course, Eisenhower most famously in 1944. I think the other thing, you talk about memory, one of the things I think that matters too is there were 16 million Americans that served in the armed forces during World War II. Maybe 250,000 of them ever served in the China, Burma, India theater. So for most people, dads, moms, granddads, grandmas' war was Europe or the Pacific. There were not a lot of people that were out here. And it's a complicated theater. The United States didn't have a lot of ground forces. They had a lot of Air Force. They had a lot of support units, but the primary forces that were being maneuvered on, particularly on the Allied side, were British, India, and Chinese. And of course, they're representing governments and countries that undergo profound changes in the 5 years after the war, which complicate the post-war. The politics is very difficult. And even some of the contending nations, India ends up splitting into what was British India into 4 nations, and so it complicates the memory. And it's only over time, as some of these things have played out, that we're able to really look back and see how important these events are to making the world that we live in today and the Asia that we deal with today.
I mean, and that's the supreme irony of this whole thing, because the US gets into war with Japan in many ways over China, over the open door in China, a balance of power on the Asian continent, to the idea of US sponsorship for China and trusteeship and support for Chiang Kai-shek and all the rest, which leads to tremendous tension between US and Japan, which Japan wants this sort of footprint on the Asian continent. It's fighting this war in China in the late 1930s, which is a terrible war of conquest, exploitation. It's all about, what's that?
No, I'm agreeing with you. Absolutely.
I mean, it's just beyond belief. And I don't think that Americans still quite have a full grasp of what that meant today. So you see the central importance of China in terms of leading to war between Japan and the United States, 2 countries that on balance had gotten on fairly well much of their modern relations. That had changed. And then when the war begins, Chiang Kai-shek is told in words, like you said, setting up the theater and making him supreme commander, he's told by the Americans in words, you're really important to us and we want you as part of this war. But then in deeds, not so much, because priority is going to other theaters and other places. Like you said, Chris, I mean, 250,000 maybe of the 16 million Americans serve in theater somewhere, and many of them were in Burma, not China.
Right.
So, from Chiang Kai-shek's point of view, he's been fighting our fight, and so it's a bit frustrating then to deal with us on his end, because he feels he ought to be getting more because he's in an existential fight. And I think Chinese remember that aspect of World War II that is completely not part of the American memory of the war.
That's true. And the mistrust, if you read some of, particularly now that his diaries have been released, the mistrust that is then engendered has a direct impact on US-Chinese relations after the war, during the Chinese Civil War. And I would argue that you can see some of that even into the Taiwan Straits, even up through the Republic of China losing the UN seat and having to give it over to the People's Republic of China, even in as late as 1971. So you're right, there are some very important seeds that are planted. Now, I will say one thing that needs to be, I don't think Chiang ever quite accepted, was the tyranny of geography that he faced. If you look at China in 1941, when the United States enters the war, it's basically lost most of its East Coast. It certainly lost the East Coast ports for any military aid, heavy military aid, to get through. That's why the Japanese invade Burma, is to cut the last land route, the Burma Road from Rangoon. Once that happens, China is effectively landlocked, because you got the Himalayas to the southwest, and there's no way you're getting anything heavy through there. Believe me, they looked and they tried. And then up to the north and west is the Soviet Union, which is neutral in the War of the Pacific. So for all intents and purposes, China is surrounded and is dependent on the hump airlift. And that's a reality that I don't think that the Chinese government ever quite accepted, at least from my reading. And that but it's another thing that creates distrust. You know, you're sending all these supplies elsewhere. What about us? And they're overlooking they're discounting some of the efforts that are made. But at the same time, promises were made, and we only filled part of them.
Yeah, and it's the pressure of global war, in which, once 1942 unfolds, I mean, there is concern that the Soviet Union will collapse, and if that happens, then you're really talking about a Nazi-dominated Europe. Britain, the United States, can probably just exist on the margins in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic at that point. So, if you're Roosevelt and Churchill, you're having to make some very difficult strategic choices, and China becomes kind of a backbencher also because by the way, the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, Army, and Army Air Forces are fighting the Japanese in the Pacific too, which is obviously front and center from an American point of view too. So in a way, it's like, what's left for Chiang Kai-shek? Plus, it's hard to get stuff to him, like you said. He's cut off, and the whole Himalayas thing that over the hump is a hand-to-mouth operation, which is only doing so much good. So really, that's why North Burma becomes of central importance to try and open up that land link to to China. That's easier said than done. So, in the 43-44 phase, what does that entail? As you described in your book, I think you really brought it to life beautifully. I wonder if you could maybe expand on it here.
So the campaign to open the road to China, the British really don't think it's possible. And I say the British command in Earl Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command really don't think it's possible. But the American general who's in command of the American forces in this region, General Joseph Stilwell, has it as his mission to help China. That's what President Roosevelt had said to him in 1942, help China. And so one of the ways he's going to do that is opening a land communication through North Burma, which, if you look at a map of the theater, even today, and this is a geographic factor today, Myanmar today, really is the hinge connecting India and China in that region. And so being able to construct a road across northern Burma, you'll be able to open that land route. Even if you don't own the rest of the country, you can still at least do that. But that still requires conquering an area the size of Pennsylvania through some of the wildest terrain, and using Chinese forces supported by American supplies and advisors, plus American infantry, Merrill's Marauders, and American air power. Stilwell, over a brilliant series of maneuvers, manages to capture the key city of Michinaw and open most of the road. And then later in 1944, after the monsoon season ends, they'll finish the job in January of 1945, and the first convoys will go into China. At the same time that's going on, the British launch an air invasion called the Chindits into central Burma to raise havoc among the Japanese, largely to support Stilwell's operations, but also to distract Japanese forces that Allied intelligence has said are going to invade India. And they do. They invade India in March of 1944. It's called the March on Delhi, is what it's billed. And the idea is if you win a couple of victories in eastern India, hopefully the Indians will rise like they had threatened to in 1942 with the Quit India movement. You'll get a movement like that, and it will knock the British out of India and pluck the crown, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, as it was known. So the Chindits, they ultimately put about 25,000, mostly British, but also African troops and Indian troops into the rear. And the Japanese later admitted that the operations of the Chindits, first under Ord Wingate, and then after he's killed, Joe Lentane, materially affected both the defense against Stilwell, but also sucked important troops away from the invasion of India. And so all these campaigns all happen all at the same time, and they all kind of climax with the Japanese defeat and the Chindits and Stilwell winning in North Burma in June, July, August 1944. And that tips the balance in favor of the Allies for the rest of the war.
And there's just so many layers to that. And this is different than the pattern you're seeing elsewhere in the war, where by spring, summer 1944, the Soviets are advancing, the Germans are retreating. That's the general pattern of operations on the Eastern Front. The Normandy invasion happens, and the Western Allies are beginning their advance. And you don't have, Battle of the Bulge notwithstanding, whole lot of Axis initiatives to really begin to turn the tables of the war. But in this case, in 1944, in Burma / India and also in China, you've got major Japanese operations that could well have won the war on the Asian continent for Japan. Like you mentioned, Chris, the siege of Imphal and Kohima and the threat to East India and all that. But of course, Ichigo too, which is happening in China and is the largest offensive in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. And so you've got this kind of crisis mentality in China at that point, in which it seems as though it's possible, at least, that the Japanese could conquer Chiang Kai-shek and collapse that government. So there's that crisis. And Chiang Kai-shek is wondering, why do I have guys fighting in North Burma when I've got this existential threat at home? Although North Burma matters to him in the sense of the supply link we've been discussing. And then, on top of it too, here's Stilwell succeeding as he's moving towards Michina, and the whole thing could be undercut by the events in East India, just like with the Chindits too. It's just a wild situation that really could have gone either way. And I believe personally, one of the things that undoes the Japanese, and this is one of their tendencies, is the failure to coordinate offensive operations. Ichigo with operations in East India is not particularly well handled. It's almost like the right hand and the left hand don't know what they're doing somehow. And this comes out in your book, that sense of how that affects the Japanese at the basic soldier level.
No, I think you're right. And that's one of the things I had only so much space to cover. And one of the things I've thought about doing is analyzing Japanese strategy in 1944. And actually, Ichigo is a good example where they attack southward toward Indochina, what today is Vietnam, to open and end up in a series of campaigns opening a rail line from Hanoi all the way up to Busan in Korea. This is an example of how Japanese strategic direction is not as good as the Allies, because had that been done in 1942, when they had the forces and the ability to do it, think about how that might have impacted the American submarine campaign, because all of a sudden, all the resources in Southeast Asia can travel by rail. And so you talk about failure of coordination. There's failure to coordinate both offensives, because they're decided as independent operations. I've never gotten a sense that the Japanese viewed the war completely holistically. And of course, whole discussion for a whole other time, John, is the tremendous distrust between the Japanese Army and Navy. Dysfunctional doesn't even begin to describe their inter-service relations. And so that all hampers overall strategic direction of the war. And by early 1944, one of the reasons that Tojo, who's Minister of War in his capacity as Minister of War and Premier of Japan, personally authorizes the invasion of India, is because the Japanese have suffered very serious defeats in 1942 and 1943 since Midway. And they're looking for an objective to try and turn things around. They're looking for opportunities to shift the war. And for them, it's opportunities on the Asian mainland, first in India, and then obviously later with Ichigo. Had it been coordinated better, the Allies had some very serious trouble beating both of them. But had they both been coordinated and mounted as a joint campaign, it would have been even closer. And it might have gone the other way. You're right.
Yeah. I mean, that could have led to serious issues. And then let's think about the consequences of what this meant for the Vietnamese and for the Indians. For the Vietnamese, you're talking about a more heavy-handed Japanese presence by that 44-45 period. Heavy-handed Japanese occupation as they try this objective again of kind of severing Burma and China from the rest of the world, which in turn means the Japanese stripping more resources from Vietnam, including food, which in turn means a famine, which probably claims something in the order of about 250,000 lives. In East India, of course, you've got the trauma of this Japanese invasion to go with the trauma of what happened in 1942. And I think this is forgotten too, especially in the West, and it's profoundly consequential, is that the British had outsourced imperialism in Burma by using Indians in a sense. And so they're retreating in that disastrous 1942 campaign, and many of them are dying. In fact, in the tens of thousands. And then war comes to East India again, and you have this sort of colonial balance there. And you see this elsewhere in the Pacific too. The Japanese coming supposedly as liberators for people who have been under the heel of white colonialists for generations, and seemingly a better alternative. But Indians are having to ask themselves, is that true or not? Which side do I fight on? What do I do? There's a kind of civil war brewing in that respect too, much less the four nations, like you said. I mean, how how do we even manage this in a way? It's just, and how would the Japanese have managed it too, even had they succeeded, is another question, I think.
Well, to put a fine point on it, when I visited in the Imphal and Kohima battlefields and had a local historian lead me around, it was a fascinating week. And there's tremendous passion for this story in those provinces. And he made a point. He said he found it his research, and it surprised him. The first time that the people of Imphal saw an airplane was 1942, when the Allied and Japanese aircraft. And by 1944, there are 6 airfields on the Imphal plain. So just think about it from just that perspective from the residents. You know, you're right. It marks this era. It marks this area, and it changed the area forever on a personal level, but also, as you correctly point out, geopolitically too. And that, that's one of the things when you look at, you make a good point about, and one of the things we need to think about the Pacific War is, for most of these former colonies, or soon to be former colonies, when the colonial armies are defeated in Singapore, in, elsewhere, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Japanese, even though they create puppet governments, it's the first glimpse of rule by locals, national rule by locals. And that's a flame, once lit, cannot be extinguished. And it's no coincidence to me that some of the leaders, even today, Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, and her connection with her dad, who was involved originally with the Japanese government and then later with the, in Sukarno in the Dutch East Indies, you got some of the Singapore politicians, even the, in the Philippines. That's no coincidence to me that the seeds of these, the same people that are in the puppet governments, many of them end up in the independence movements afterwards too.
Absolutely.
And then, Subhas Chandra Bose and the INA, the Indian National Army, which is recruited from Indian prisoners of war in Singapore, and accompanies, there are elements of it that accompany the Japanese invasion of India, and actually raise the flag both over the Andaman Islands, but also raise the flag. There's a museum to it today just outside Imphal. And Bose is remembered today there. You talk about Civil War. He's remembered as a patriotic Indian. They're raising statues to him. They just put a statue to him in central New Delhi. Where there used to be a statue of George V, as a matter of fact. So that says something about the memory, and he and his INA people are remembered as patriotic Indians that fought for a free India. They don't like to talk about that they were on the side of the Axis, and that he had originally tried to ally with the Germans and then escaped by submarine. I mean, you talk about an adventure story. Bose's war is fascinating. But this influences national identity and national memory today in India, and is still very much with us. And so, you're right. There's so many strands. There's so much going on, and there's so much that still echoes to today.
It's momentous. And I mean, World War II is a civil war in many places on the planet, especially in the Asian continent. And in many respects, as you get to 1945, the war is just beginning. The war is just beginning in Vietnam. The war is just beginning in India, in Burma, in Korea, in Manchuria, in China. Name a place, the war is just beginning. In some ways, the Philippines, although I would argue in a way, the Americans are getting ahead of this problem by promising the Philippines its independence. Then the question is, what sort of independence and under whom? And of course, that's the other thing too. It is a little far afield from what we're talking about, but it still dovetails with the topic in a way. The Philippines is a place where the Americans invest massive resources in World War II. I mean, it's the nexus of the Pacific War without any question. And yet it could have ended up as a communist stronghold within a decade at the end of World War II. And just as in Europe, France and Italy very much could have gone in that direction politically. So it's my point is, World War II doesn't resolve a lot in some locales. There's nations in the balance, as you've put it very, very well. And it's not just in 43 and 44, it's in the years and sort of decades to follow, which I think is what points to how important your topic is, and how we may even view it differently 10 years from now or 20 than we do right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to jump in here because it was the time of the colonial period at that moment, and the British Empire that, Chris, you mentioned just now, the INA, the boss, and because Indians, the Quit India movement was at that time was happening, and all Indians were trying to liberate the country from the British Empire. And at that time, while you are saying the prisoners of war, and they were called the freedom fighters for India, like at that time. So the INA, the leader of the INA, Subhas Chandra Bose, and his colleagues, they took the training in Japan and the Russia at that time, that USSR. They were helping them against the British Empire, and the World War II that brought due to that, not one but many other reasons were there, and the Indians under the leadership of Gandhi that asserted that Indians are not going to take the part in this fight until they are promised to for the freedom, for their self-rule. And that was the internal history of India's freedom struggle at that time that was happening. And at the promise of just the crown or the Mountbatten, that you said, General Mountbatten, on the promise that yes, after if Indians took part, Indian army or an Indian military takes part in this World War II, and then the British Empire promised to liberate the India. And that was how the divided at that time of the country. One, there was under the leadership of Gandhi, and the other was they were not even want to believe a single for a moment on British Empire. That was the INA that you mentioned in that. So that was the very complex situation at the time, because most of the countries in Asia and Africa, they were the colonies who were taking part in that. And I will come on the theater later, that how this theater is crucial at the time, and how the allies, what will be the shape of allies if China invades Taiwan or China invades India at any point. And we would be happy to see if you have some maps of that region, like you must have mentioned the map in your book, right?
That's one of the things that I was very glad about my publisher. They let me put as many maps in there as I wanted. And that is, and John, I know you can attest to this. You can never have too many maps.
Absolutely.
Particularly an area like this, that, let's be honest, most people in the United States in particular, they may have what William Manchester called a mental map of Europe, or a rough idea of Europe and the relative proximity. This is a part of the world that most Americans don't necessarily have an understanding. So you have to have good maps. And you're right. To your point about Gandhi, real quick, one of the things that I found in my research, Gandhi is, the Indian Constitution calls him the father of the nation. The first use of that term was by Bose. When the Japanese army is retreating and the march on Delhi is not going to succeed, he sends a radio broadcast in July of 1944 to Gandhi. I don't think Gandhi ever heard it, but he says, "Father of the nation, will you help us in our hour of need?" And that to me, that solidifies everything you just said about the importance and about how it still impacts today.
Yes, that rightly, like you said, it was the first boss who said the father of nation to Gandhi. But again, that Gandhi was like used non-violence and other means of way to fight that freedom struggle. But on the other side, like Bose and his colleagues, they were fighting with weapons. They were that's the point of difference between two. So in Indian, when we in my college undergraduate study, and of course in my high school, we have a lot of like in every grade we have Indian history books, and mostly on the freedom struggle. So
Right.
that leads the differences between two, like by the violent means or by the non-violent means. So, and that leads, like the boss reach to Japan, reach to the USSR for help to fight with the British Empire. So that was a very, very complex and situation at the World War II. But now most of the countries, like almost all countries, are liberated. No, and like it's not a colonialism now, but like we can say in the post-colonialism history, how like China's assertive behavior is again in this region is very crucial, and how the balance in nations takes shape of the future global politics.
Yeah, I mean, World War II in Asia, to some extent, is a colonial struggle, a decolonization in so many places, and Japan wanting to basically replace what was a kind of declining European and sort of white-dominated colonialism with a brand new, brand of colonialism coming from Asia this time, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So then when Japan is defeated, what is to happen in so many of these places? I mean, that's what it comes down to, in terms of the struggle just beginning. Gandhi, too, here's another thing that kind of occurs to me as we're talking about him. We talk about the importance and influence of all of these events. Think about Gandhi's influence here on the American Civil Rights Movement, which I would argue is a crucial element of World War II from a U.S. perspective. And one of the reasons why World War II is so important in the history of this country is it really gives wings to a major civil rights movement, which had been on the sort of descendant from Reconstruction forward, with basically an apartheid system in this country, in much of it. And so this isn't going to happen without the forces unleashed by World War II. And then you have the influence of Gandhi on key civil rights leaders, of course, most notably Dr. King. So in a way, it's interesting how what's going on in India spills over to what's going on in the United States, too, in that respect.
And to that point, another surprising thing I found in my research, an underappreciated fact, of the 15,000 Americans that worked on building the Lido Road, in other words, following Stilwell's army across, 60% of them were African American in segregated engineer units. It is the largest single deployment of African Americans overseas, except for the two combat divisions, the 92nd and the 93rd. It's huge for African Americans. The Lido Road and the Alaska Highway are two very important moments, and help feed this, help light the fire of the civil rights movement that you're talking about, and are two achievements that they can point to. So yeah, it's all of a piece, and it all ripples many places.
It does. And CBI, from a U.S. Army perspective, had a reputation of being more racially progressive than many other theaters and many other commands. There are riots going on in England in spring of 1944, for instance, between African-American segregated unit soldiers and like the 82nd Airborne Division, for instance. In CBI, there is an attempt to have more racial equality, and especially in bases in India, at R&R centers, more in maybe portions of Burma and India than in China. Of course, that's another matter too, of
Yeah.
Chiang Kai-shek and his attitude about African Americans and all that we could touch on. But there's at least an attempt, and I don't know that that's an accident either, an attempt to create more racial equality on the part of U.S. military authorities in theater as well. And one of the accounts I found was a commander, a U.S. Army commander, and sort of not. I mean, he's sort of applauding this, and he's saying, "Believe you me, the locals noticed. They noticed how whites treated non-whites and whatnot in our army, and that was, in his view, kind of a force multiplier for his mission, because it meant good relations with locals, and it meant just a better operating environment too. So it was pragmatic as well."
Yeah, my research bore a lot of that out as well. I didn't explore it quite as deeply as you, but I found that as well. And there's a couple of great quotes. And even if you look in the Army official histories, they touch on this as well. And you're right, there's a different, and it comes from the top. And I think if you look at some of the senior commanders who have long experience in that region, General Stilwell had several tours in China with the U.S. Embassy, a military observer. Claire Chennault with 14th Air Force in China, of course, having a commission in the Chinese Air Force also. It starts at the top, this idea that it's just a different approach to the question of how you work with different races and different nations than you find in some other places.
And of course, Merrill's Marauders, the main, American ground combat unit in theater, has famously good relations with the African American engineering units.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly you see that in terms of the culture on the ground. But I definitely, Chris, I think that you mentioned Stilwell. This is something Stilwell is kind of promoting for all of his warts. I think this is a guy who understands something in the order of cultural differences and racial differences. He has this kind of funny incident during the 1944 campaign, in which, of course, as you know, he's everywhere. And he's all over the place, and so he's I think he's on a boat crossing a river at one point, and it's miserable and rainy, and of course he looks old and he looks like just any other soldier. And an African American soldier is sitting right next to him, and he turns to him. He doesn't know he's a general, and he says, "Boy, your draft board must really be hurting to send a guy as old as you here." And still just kind of laughs. He's like, "Yeah, I know, I agree with you." So he has that kind of mentality in dealing with soldiers, of just a kind of everyday guy in that respect. And believe you me, again, that's noticed.
I agree. Yeah, and Stilwell was at his best as a field commander. I mean, for all of
Yep.
he was a smart man. He was a student of humanity. We can debate, and that's probably a whole discussion for a whole other time, his diplomatic limitations.
Mhm.
The thing I always remind people is, if you want to understand Joe Stilwell and what he dealt with, it took a minimum of 3 people to replace him when he was recalled in 1944, in October 1944. And it's one person doing that many jobs. You're going to have issues. But as a field commander and as a leader of troops, and you see it again later when he takes over 10th Army on Okinawa after General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. is killed. He is an outstanding leader of forces and knows how to prepare, conduct, and lead a campaign. And the troops he's fighting in North Burma are some of the best troops in the Japanese army. The 18th Division is known as the Chrysanthemum Division, and the chrysanthemum is the symbol of the imperial throne. So that marks it as an elite division. And the 18th has already seen extremely good, tough fighting in Singapore and in Burma before, in the 42 campaigns. And these are first-class troops. And Stilwell is able to maul that division over time and manage to still achieve his objectives.
And he's doing it with the quite innovative use of air power in supply drops for deep penetration light infantry operations. And I mean, there's no other way to do it except for that, given the terrain and the realities. And here again, cultural understanding comes into play too. Ironic, because obviously Stilwell famously couldn't get along with Shang and sort of the culture of the Chinese government. But in this instance, he has promoted a very good situation where the Americans are working with local tribesmen in northern Burma, Kachin tribesmen, General Pierce, later General Pierce, at that point Colonel Pierce, and his whole special operating unit, that I would argue is an enormous force multiplier for Merrill's Marauders. It's one of the reasons why they continue to have the initiative time and again to get in the Japanese rear. Like you said, Chris, they're fighting an excellent Japanese division, well led too, I would argue, and yet they're just constantly on the back foot against Stilwell's people in the spring of 1944. And I do think that's a reason why the air power component and the cultural side of it.
Well, Stilwell was an intelligence officer and a defense attaché, and he was a language officer also. So he, early in his career, if you look at his biography, he understood very quickly the importance of understanding people, understanding culture, and as an intelligence officer, understanding the value of a network, much like OSS Detachment 101 is what you're talking about with peers, and developing those, the local sources and being able to work with them and recognizing the value of them. One of the lines that I found in my research, and I quote in the book, is that a lot of those the Kachin Hill people knew where the Japanese were better than anybody. Even the Japanese knew where they were. And Stilwell understood, with that background, he understood the value of this. And to his credit, so did Slim and some of the British commanders with V-Force over in northeastern India. So it wasn't just Stilwell, but it took a certain type of officer, broad-minded officer, to cultivate and exploit those resources.
And the Japanese find themselves on the wrong end of that almost everywhere in the Pacific in terms of local grassroots lack of support. The Allies, for all their warts, are better at that. They're better at cultural outreach, for instance, on New Guinea. They're certainly the Philippines. The Japanese are really on the wrong end of it there. Eventually in Korea, there's a lot of different examples of this. China, obviously, North Burma, maybe even Eastern India, once it comes to it in some respects too. And it really strikes me as so profound. It's the same pattern you see in Europe. The Allies are much the better at reaching out to grassroots folks and all that. Partially it's just because of the incredible Nazi repression too.
Right.
But it's profoundly ironic, because then you're going to find, certainly from an American perspective, being on the wrong end of that in later 20th century and 21st century wars too. But it shows you how important that is for your strategic objectives. And I think studying the CBI campaign is a really good way to come to grips with that and learn a lot about it.
I think you're right. And one of the things, one of my early writings, I wrote an article where I looked at, it's called The Coming of Modern War. And I realized I had a lot more to say, which I then turned into the book. And if you look at these campaigns, particularly these 43, 44 campaigns, they foreshadow a lot that's coming in modern warfare and in warfare over the next 50, 70, 75 years. And a lot of the trends that we see. For example, in ISIS 2015, the United States was fighting with the Iraqi army. They had about 3,000 combat troops and advisors, which was the strength of Merrill's Marauders, and air power and supplies, which is a very close parallel, and a 3-star general in charge. That is General Stilwell in North Burma.
It is.
In 1944.
Yeah.
And it's an exact parallel. And so that's something, if you want case studies of, what the Army and what the national military needs to look at for what the future might be, CBI is has some really strong examples.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great parallel, Chris. I mean, you're right down to the 3-star general. I mean, that's the other thing that's so mind-blowing about it, and the importance of air power, but ground power being ultimately preeminent, because obviously the ground has to be controlled, and that can only be done with troops on the ground. And this is what Stilwell is sort of crying out for, especially as Merrill's Marauder is sort of frittering away and dying through this campaign in spring of 1944. Stilwell then has to become ruthless because he's out of combat soldiers. And this then is, I mean, Merrill's Marauders goes through, I mean, it's like you said, it's a regimental size unit, 3,000 or so. You're in infantry combat for 2 to 3 months. You're going to lose everybody in terms of becoming a casualty, not dead necessarily, but wounded and sick and whatever, which means you've got to have replacements. Well, any typical infantry regiment operating in Normandy or operating in Italy or on Iwo Jima or something like that is going to suffer that kind of attrition. The problem for Stilwell is he's not going to get any reinforcements, and on a meaningful level,
Right.
enough to support that. So then he has to become this ruthless guy of keeping these guys in operation during the siege of Michina and all that, and it just turns into this horrible experience for these guys. But it also, I would argue, is a kind of microcosm for the de-emphasis of theater relative to other strategic priorities in World War II.
It's a question of priority. And then actually, one of my distant relatives, Gary Bjorga, pointed out it's also a problem of coalition warfare, because the Chindits are also reaching the end of their rope at the same time. And then you've got all these Chinese soldiers that are involved in the siege of Michina. And what if you pull out the Marauders, like they really need to after late May 1944? Well, why are you favoring the United States, you, General Stilwell of the U.S. Army, as opposed to keeping the British and the Chinese? So there's this coalition politics that are involved and really kind of freeze everybody in place until Michina is taken. And that's a lesson in coalition warfare that needs to be paid attention to. And we've seen recur again and again in Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere. And that's, again, another case study, another parallel, another foreshadowing of, the future.
It's a great point, and especially like from a Chinese perspective, because they've had 2+ divisions that have been fighting with Stilwell. They're really the meat of his campaign in some ways.
They're the core of his army.
They are, and obviously Ichigo is happening, and you've got the Y force, which is sort of in this holding pattern, but then sort of fighting and sort of not, and all that. And so, from a Chinese perspective, if he pulls the Americans out, then the Chinese are saying, well, we've been in there and all this, and we've suffered even greater losses. Why do we have to stay when the Americans are going to protect themselves too? That is, so it's not just as simple as if we are American, corps commanders on the line somewhere in France, and we can pull out one division or one regiment and bring another in. There's no other implication of that besides our manpower. In this case, the coalition side of it is really quite central, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And that's, what you have out in the CBI, which is different than the other theaters, and you touched on it, is the United States is providing resources, but because the ground combat power comes from other nations, the United States is achieving its objectives through leverage as much or more than sometimes direct action. And that makes things really complex. Dean Rusk, who the later Secretary of State, was an operations officer in Stilwell's headquarters, and talked about how he had to do everything through negotiation, because the United States was providing resources. They were providing a lot of things, but that gave them leverage, but it was not direct. You couldn't give a direct order necessarily, but you could use your influence and relationships and things like that. And, that's not a style of warfare the United States had fought a whole lot of before. And it makes CBI unique among all the major Allied theaters of the war. And, again, coming back to foreshadowing, I know I've said it a couple times already, but it's another foreshadowing when you look at some of the wars the United States has tried to fight since.
Big time. And just like NATO structure, NATO forces, CETO structure, CETO forces, MACV in Vietnam. I mean, like Horn of Africa operations, or we could probably sit here if we wanted to long enough, come up with 22 to 30 different scenarios in which it's been much quite similar to what Dean Rusk, experience. And I always like to think that's partially what kind of propels his career in the State Department, having to do so much kind of international negotiating, you know.
His memoirs are very interesting, and he actually points up how
Yeah.
his time in the China-Burma-India theater had a tremendous influence on him going forward, because he goes from there back to Washington and works for George Marshall as Secretary of State. He actually writes in his memoirs and notes the irony of history, because when the French administration's finally wiped out and the Vietnamese insurgency starts in 1945, from the headquarters, what was Stilwell's headquarters, they start airdropping supplies to Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who oversees those operations is Dean Rusk, who, as Kennedy and Johnson's Secretary of State, will be on the other side, obviously, and be an adversary. And he points that out. These are the ironies of history.
They are. God, it really is. It's just fascinating stuff. Absolutely. I wonder if there's any questions.
Yeah. And Jessica, if you have the moderator's questions, please go
Sure.
ahead.
Thank you all so much too for your incredible insight and feedback. I really appreciated just hearing all the knowledge you all shared. But of course, when I started reading this from the lens of my own research of studying India, naturally, that was what I was thinking about throughout the book. And so I was curious to hear, Chris, from your perspective, how much of an impact do you believe these campaigns have on present day Indian strategic planning?
That's difficult to answer for the simple fact that I don't know the current Indian strategic planning, but I can tell you a couple of things that I think are commonalities. First of all, the Indian Army had fought a counterinsurgency in Eastern India, and I talk about it in the epilogue of my book. Some of these nationalist movements and independence movements in North Burma and in the eastern part of Nagaland and eastern part of Manipur, those really weren't ended until 2013, 2012 timeframe. And that's only when some of these battlefields have been open for tourists. Most of the battlefields I wrote about, we can't visit today. And we couldn't visit when I wrote this back in 2018, because they're still active war zones. The Arakan, which today is where there's issues with the Rohingya in southwestern Burma. North Burma, it still has an active insurgency that has ended in India. So from that perspective, it was very much an active zone. But the other thing is the Indian Army, there's been talk of reopening the Stillwell Road corridor. That road is still there. And the idea that it's an access point, as the Indian Army considers potential conflicts with China, the Himalayan front, but China's building expressways along that parallel the old Burma Road corridor, and China is eyeing getting into North Burma and then eventually getting down to the coast, and so the geography is still the same. And if you want to access Eastern India, you got to go through Burma. And as 1944 showed, 44, 45 showed, it's not that far, and it is possible. And so when you think about it from that perspective, this is an area of concern, a strategic concern for India.
Great. Thank
I
you
would
so
like
much.
to just add on this, what the Chris said. Exactly, there was some rebel groups and the insurgencies in the northeastern part of India quite a long time after the independence. And consistently, the Indian strategic leaders and political leaders took the steps to control that by assimilating them in the mainstream with different plannings, and it's controlled. Most of the groups are controlled now, and if we just think about the Indo-Pacific theater, nowadays it's connect India's foreign policy, act east and look east policy that connects India to the Southeast Asian nations via Burma or via the northeastern, not the Burma, but from the northeastern country and northeastern states. provinces in India, like Nagaland and Imphal. These are the, and of course, there is active insurgency in Myanmar, while there is a military rule since almost after 2 years, from January or February 2021. So it's a kind of concern for India's eastern border, still the concern due to the Rohingya refugees and due to the instability in Myanmar. And the Myanmar is a part of the BRI, that is the Chinese has built very fast, accessible roads and train lines there, but still, like from Indian part, like the Indian foreign policy part, like the Mekong security security plan, and India's foreign policy leaders and Indian leaders trying to connect this region to the Southeast Asian and to make the safer Himalayan region from the Chinese assertive way that is still going on since 2022 from the Galwan phase of and in some like before 3 and 4 years, like in 2017, it was in Bhutan, Doklam, that skirmishes happened between India and Chinese armies. So it's still very crucial, very sensitive region, but of course, due to the importance of this Indo-Pacific region and the theater, the US and India, or of course the Quad members. So there's a lot of happening there.
Great. Thank you both so much. I just have one more question, a broader question. So there were several lessons from these campaigns on multiple fronts, of course, the importance of logistics, of air power. How do you believe that this has shaped the future of combat in the Indo-Pacific?
John, feel free to weigh in on that.
Well, I think there's actually, in the longer run, a tendency by the 21st century, at least, to think of it as the Navy's theater, as a theater for sea power and air power. And of course, I mean, there's no question, obviously, those things are crucial. But I think there's a tendency in American strategic and military policy circles to overemphasize that at the expense of the land power. And I think by studying, say, Stilwell's 1944 campaign, you can see certainly the absolute crucial importance of excellent land forces working in tandem with aerial assets. I mean, and of course, what's supplying them ultimately is secure sea lanes too. So we have to point that out. So my point is, I think that when you study that campaign, you see the vitality of air, land, and sea power all working together in a very difficult area in which to operate. But ultimately, the preeminence of land power in the sense of ultimate influence. That Stilwell, what he's doing is he's trying to create a land supply route into China. The reason that becomes a priority, not just for him really, but for the Joint Chiefs in Washington, D.C., is that the airlift operations were too problematic at that time. Now, that didn't mean they always would be in any kind of scenario. I mean, the Berlin airlift is a prime example otherwise. But in this case, ultimately, it really did come down to land power. And I fully admit my own bias as a infantry-centered historian, that certainly I'm going to look at the world that way, but I think there's much historical evidence to recommend that, to say this is at least the tendency. And so I don't know why the Indo-Pacific really is any different. And I think when you look at the 1944 and 45 experiences in CBI, I think you kind of see it point in that direction too.
Right. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I would echo all that, and I would just say the United States, when they fought, they before 1940, let's say 1950, the Korean War, there were two great coalition enterprises the United States had done. The first was the Boxer Rebellion, which was by its very nature limited, but a region-wide coalition war that the United States fights, and really the greatest coalition war the United States has fought in the Indo-Pacific, is Stilwell in the China, Burma, India theater. And so to my mind, John is absolutely right. In many ways, we would see a very similar, I would imagine, see something very similar, or a very similar sort of playbook, if you will, for going forward, and how the United States can be a coalition partner with locals and regional partners, and all organize and engage around a common objective.
Which is so
There's-
crucial.
Yeah, there's tremendous lessons, and to me, you can use these methods again. They work just as well.
Yeah. I mean, the last time this country fought a major war without allies is the Spanish-American War. So yeah, coalition warfare is absolutely crucial. No
And your
doubt.
point about land
Great
power,
point.
Stillwell, I made a point of putting this in the book, was Stillwell actually talked about. He says the great limitation of an Air Force is it can't hold ground. And the same is true of the Navy. You need that land power, whether it's securing island bases, an island hopping campaign like you saw in the Pacific War, whether it's opening land corridors like you see in 1944, whatever it is, you need that land power. And
Yep.
without all three working together, air, land, and sea, you're not going to get done what you need in the Indo-Pacific.
Yep. And human beings are terrestrial creatures. So that means land power becomes pretty darn important. When and if that changes, okay, then maybe warfare changes. But that's where we sit today, I think, still.
Right. Thank you all so much. If we don't have any further questions, we could wrap up for today, but thank you all again for your excellent contributions and for your insight. Of course, thank you to Indu for coordinating the event, Professor McManus for leading the discussion, and of course, we want to commend Chris for a well-written and informative book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, good stuff.
Great job. And, we look forward to discussing further again in the future.